As a young woman slowly grows weaker, a murder investigation gains strength. To solve it, detectives must extract a dark family secret from the grave. A tight circle of friends contracts as, one by one, its members die mysteriously. The circumstances are suspicious, but there's little evidence of murder. When a woman is poisoned to death, her survivors point fingers at each other. To find the killer, investigators must get to the source of the bad blood. Even when its symptoms are dramatic, poison is a subtle menace. The poisoner is a two-faced monster whose loved ones become victims of tainted trust. On September 19, 1979, Marie Hilly rushed to the University of Alabama Hospital in Birmingham. Her 19-year-old daughter, Carol, was very sick. For the past 5 months, she'd suffered severe vomiting, stomach cramps, a deteriorating nervous system, and paralysis in her legs. Her hands became clawed and nearly useless. Marie, a widow who doted on her only daughter, was frantic to find a cure for Carol's grave illness.
Should we be able to hold anything down?
Yeah.
Good.
After months of shuttling Carol from doctor to doctor, seldom leaving her bedside, Marie was at the end of her rope. Doctors told her that Carol might have a virus or some other condition, but she'd yet to get a clear diagnosis about what was crippling her daughter. Carol's illness was taking its toll on Marie as well.
Marie Hilly.
I'm Marie Hilly.
On Carol's first day at the University of Alabama Hospital, a plainclothes police officer came looking for Marie.
Yes, what can I do for you?
He asked if he could speak to her in private.
To tell you the truth, I don't really want to talk to you about right here.
Be right back, Carol.
Carol's mounting medical bills were wreaking havoc with Marie's finances. A bank and a furniture store in nearby Anniston filed complaints against her for passing bad checks. The officer served Marie with an arrest warrant. He was taking her to jail. Not wanting to alarm her daughter, Marie made up a story about why she had to leave. Carol had no knowledge of her mom's arrest. The next day, when Carol couldn't reach her mother, she called her Aunt Frida, who came to see her and tell her about Marie. Frida had news for the doctors, too, expressing her concern about Marie's care of Carol. She said that Marie moved Carol from hospital to hospital before the young woman could be properly diagnosed. She also claimed to have witnessed Marie giving Carol shots. She feared that Marie's desperate attempts to heal her daughter were only making her more ill. This possibility made Carol's doctor rethink his diagnosis. Perhaps her illness was caused by a toxin rather than a virus. He realized her symptoms were consistent with heavy metal poisoning, most commonly arsenic. Often called the great imitator, arsenic routinely escapes early diagnosis, masquerading as food poisoning or the flu. The misjudgment could be fatal, according to forensic toxicologist Chip Walls, now lab director at the University of Miami School of Medicine.
In many cases, the chronic poisoning with arsenic has been missed at the early stages, and the person either goes on and either gets better or dies from the chronic poisoning.
Hi, Miss Hilly. We're going to take a nail sample.
But once
Hair
it's
sample,
suspected,
and it won't hurt.
long-term arsenic poisoning is easy to diagnose. Carol's fingernails displayed the broad white lines called Mees lines that signal the presence of arsenic in the bloodstream for longer than 6 weeks. Following up on this crucial discovery, nail and hair samples were sent to the lab to determine the extent of her poisoning. That would help determine the source of her exposure and how long she'd been exposed. The samples are carefully weighed before they're put into what's called a digesting flask. Nitric and sulfuric acid are mixed with the sample and heated. The digested sample is then ready to be analyzed. Early readings showed high levels of the poison in Carol's samples, but it would take weeks to get more detailed results. Because arsenic is found in nature and is a common ingredient in pesticides, her exposure could have been accidental. But not everyone believed that.
How are you?
While the samples were being tested, Anniston police received a letter from Carol's brother.
Forensic report. I thought you might want to see what that thing looks like.
From Hilly's son?
He believed that Marie Hilly may have killed her husband 4 years earlier and was now poisoning her daughter. Lieutenant Gary Carroll, now chief investigator, went to speak with Carol Hilly.
During the interview, Carol had outlined a number of events that had occurred to her beginning sometime, I think, in mid-April of 1979.
Carol explained that within a month she'd endured 2 hospital stays. She enjoyed a brief recovery until August, when her illness took a turn for the worse.
Your doctor gives you?
She told detectives that the change occurred just after she moved from her mother's house to her own apartment.
Pete, I brought you something to drink.
Thanks.
Though Carol looked forward to living alone, Marie practically moved in with her from the very first day, keeping house and doing most of the cooking.
So much.
Carol, honey, we're ready to go.
Within days, she fell seriously ill, suffering from nausea and severe cramps. Marie rushed her to a hospital where she stayed for a week. But when doctors offered no quick solution, Marie abruptly moved Carol to another hospital. Carol recalled that in September, while she was in the hospital, her mother gave her 2 orange pills and 2 injections. Marie told her daughter they would ease the paralysis in her legs, but still
Here it
her
comes.
illness
It's gonna be real
progressed.
sick. And here it goes.
Marie Hilly's behavior prompted Lieutenant Carroll to request the police file on her. He knew that she had been a victim of a series of strange events ever since her husband died. Carroll hoped the files might reveal some pattern.
Back in 1977, our police department had received numerous complaints from Marie Hilly regarding vandalisms, harassing phone calls, burglaries, fires, and etc. Many things going on at her residence.
Marie collected substantial insurance claims for damage to her house, her daughter's car, and her husband Frank's death. Seeing a possible motive, Lieutenant Carroll looked into the status of Carol Hilly's life insurance.
Written with the offhand. Call the coroner about this.
Marie was the beneficiary, but the policy had lapsed.
I'll meet with you tomorrow.
According to the insurance company, Marie had made several desperate attempts to have it reinstated, but every one of her checks bounced.
Yeah.
Following up on the letter sent by Carol Hilly's brother, Lieutenant Carroll received a copy of Frank Hilly's medical records. Frank and Marie Hilly appeared to be an average, happy couple. They were married for 25 years and raised 2 children, Mike and Carol. As her kids were growing up, Marie maintained an active social life. Frank enjoyed his role of the hard-working breadwinner, active, healthy, and rarely missing a day of work.
I'll be right back.
But one evening in May 1975, Frank came home in agony from an upset stomach. He stayed home most of the next week. Marie tended to him around the clock. But Frank's condition worsened rapidly.
Here, it's okay.
Within a matter of days, he was dead.
No, don't lift your head.
At the time, the circumstances were considered tragic, but not criminal. And even now, it seemed inconceivable that a woman could be cold-blooded enough to poison her own family. Marie Hilly just didn't fit the mold of murderer. But in hindsight, Frank Hilly's symptoms suggested a classic case of arsenic poisoning. To be sure, investigators needed to exhume his body.
During her at any
It
time.
would be easier
You
with
understand these
Marie's
rights as I read
permission.
them to you?
Yes.
With these rights in mind, would you...
She was still in custody for writing bad checks. She denied any involvement in her husband's death
Oh, just sign this, please, right here.
and granted permission for his exhumation and autopsy.
The person at the hospital?
When asked about Carol, she denied poisoning her or even giving her medication. But investigators persisted.
Finally, upon being confronted about having given Carol shots, she finally admitted that she did give Carol some shots. She says she got, it was some medication she got from a nurse who worked at one of the hospitals. Case in, please.
But police were unable to locate a nurse matching the name or description Marie gave.
Thank you, Bob.
1 week later, authorities exhumed Frank Hilly's body. It's said that dead men tell no tales, but only Frank could tell them if his devoted wife and the mother of his children was a murderer. While investigators in Alabama collected hair and nail samples from Frank Hilly's exhumed remains, the results from Carol Hilly's arsenic testing came back from the lab. The analysis showed abnormal levels of arsenic along the length of her hair, demonstrating long-term exposure to the poison. The hair closest to Carol's scalp had 35 times the amount of arsenic than on the outer part, revealing that she'd received recent high doses. Her mother, Marie Hilly, was still the prime suspect in the slow and painful poisoning of her daughter. All that remained was the proof. It wasn't long in coming. On the morning of October 8th, police received a note from Carol's Aunt Frida, along with a prescription bottle containing a clear liquid. The note said she found the bottle in Marie's jewelry box. Detective Carroll sent the bottle for analysis. A half hour later, the lab confirmed the bottle contained arsenic. A similar vial was taken from Marie's purse when she was first arrested for check bouncing. It appeared empty, but investigators suspected it might hold some residue. They rinsed it with distilled water, then tested the rinse water. Once again, they found arsenic.
Mrs. Hilly, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of your daughter.
On October 9, 1979, Marie Hilly was served with warrants
You have the
charging
right
her
to
with
remain
attempting to
silent,
poison Carol.
Not make any statement at all. Any statement you make may
Additional
and
warrants
probably
were
will
served
be
for
used
passing
against you
more
in
bad
law.
checks. But these charges paled in comparison to
You have
what
the right to
police
have a
still
lawyer
suspected,
present to advise you
that
either
Marie
prior to
Hilly
the
had
question
murdered
or
her
during
husband.
the questioning.
Still,
If
they
you
had
are
no
unable to
proof.
hire a lawyer, you have the right to have a lawyer appointed to
We
counsel
had not received any information from the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences on the autopsy results from Frank, so we were awaiting those. And during the meantime, she made bond and got out on the attempt to poison charge and also the 2 check charges.
But Marie could not feel too relieved. The same tests that found arsenic in her daughter's system were being used on samples taken from her late husband, and with much the same result. Frank Hilly had been poisoned. The evidence showed that the poison was taken a little at a time, with a large dose at the end. On January 11, 1980, the Calhoun County Grand Jury indicted Marie Hilly for first-degree murder. Hilly received life plus 20 years for attempting to poison her daughter. But Marie Hilly wound up serving only a fraction of that time. After 3 years, she'd manipulated the warden into trusting her with a 3-day furlough. When it was time for her to return, it was clear that Marie Hilly had escaped. But her getaway didn't last. A week later, she was discovered, apparently trying to break into a house. Her clothes were soaked and she acted delirious. She suffered a massive heart attack and died that evening. Marie Hilly was buried next to her husband Frank, the man she'd poisoned to death. Why would a seemingly devoted wife and mother poison members of her family? Perhaps money was the original motive. But since her daughter Carol's life insurance policy had lapsed, there was no financial reward in killing her. Maybe, in Marie Hilly's mind, murder became its own reward. In that regard, she wasn't alone. On the afternoon of June 28, 1987, Carrie Middleton answered a call to check on 30-year-old Lisa K. Chandler in Odessa, Texas. Lisa had been seriously depressed, and her friends were concerned. Carrie found Lisa in her bedroom, dead. She ran to phone the police, not to call in a suicide, but to report a murder. Police found no evidence of a crime, no forced entry or signs of struggle. In fact, there seemed no cause of death at all.
You need to bag this note. Don, give me a bag to put
On the
this note in.
nightstand lay a scrap of paper with scribbled notes, but it didn't mention suicide or anything else that could be related to Lisa's death.
I'm gonna take this out. Be right back.
A washcloth on the floor had no stains or other visible clues. It seemed the victim had died peacefully and mysteriously in her sleep.
Morning, Gene. How are you this morning?
According to Detective Mickey Brown, now a chief of police,
Okay.
that was reason enough to investigate
Okay, very
further.
good. Thank you.
You have a victim here that apparently there's no reason for cause of death, and this is a young female. There's no trauma, so I immediately become suspicious as to what caused this young lady's death.
Out of her mind with grief, Carrie Middleton insisted to police that her friend was murdered. But without any evidence, their best strategy was to wait for the autopsy report.
He told me to check all the police stuff. I know. Look,
Tissue samples were sent to the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine, where forensic toxicologist Gary Wimbish tested them.
We look for the drugs or substances with the highest probability of having an association with the cause of death. For example, ethyl alcohol, carbon monoxide, other volatile substances or alcohols that may have been involved. Drugs of abuse would be high priority, and then second with routine prescription medication.
Blood specimens revealed a high concentration of ethyl alcohol found in wine or beer. Though it may have contributed, the alcohol couldn't have caused Lisa's death on its own. With the victim's death still a mystery, Detective Brown couldn't discount the possibility of foul play. He'd learned from Carrie Middleton that Lisa was in the middle of a bitter divorce from her husband, Kyle. Carrie also said Lisa was having an affair with David Dowler, a mutual friend with an exotic lifestyle.
Well, the more she talked, she got into telling us about Dowler, and it began to read like a Tom Clancy novel. You know, he was claiming to work for the government, to be work for the CIA, to be a spy catcher, things of that nature. And she was very sincere in what she was telling us, but it seemed far out at the time.
Because Dowler was the last person to be seen with the victim, an interview was arranged. He was cooperative and seemed friendly and personable. Dowler claimed Carrie was mistaken about his work for the CIA. But he did share the opinion that Lisa Chandler was a victim of foul play. He also had an idea of who her killer was, Kyle Chandler, Lisa's husband. He said Kyle was furious that she was cheating on him.
Good morning.
Kyle Chandler was next on the list to be interviewed. Fearing he was the prime suspect in his wife's death, Chandler brought his lawyer with him. Kyle also felt that Lisa was murdered, but he pointed the finger back at his accuser, David Dowler.
The names of your closest friends that you and Lisa have? Juan, how are you?
Hi, Juan.
Kyle Chandler portrayed Dowler as an unusual man with a sinister edge. He owned and operated a one-hour photo shop, but claimed that was only a cover for his real job as a CIA agent. As a government insider, Dowler claimed he knew in advance which friends were in danger. He seemed to be right. According to Kyle Chandler, Dowler knew more than he was letting on about the death of Lisa Chandler and the unexplained deaths of two of their other friends. The investigation into Lisa Chandler's death was taking an unexpected turn. When Detective Mickey Brown looked back over the files, he discovered that Lisa Chandler was the third of her circle of friends to die mysteriously. And in each case, David Dowler was mentioned as one of the last people to see the victim alive. 4 years before the death of Lisa Chandler, another of Dowler's girlfriends met a similar fate. Lisa Craig was found lying as if she'd died in her sleep. There were no signs of forced entry into her home, nor any signs of trauma on her body. The only suspicious things were notes scribbled in the margins of her Bible. Craig believed someone wanted to kill her. Craig had a history of anorexia nervosa. An autopsy found no other evidence, so the medical examiner concluded she died as a result of that condition. However, since there was no specific cause of death, he left her file open and saved her tissue samples.
Hi, ma'am. How are you today? What can I
3
do for
years
you?
later, the next to die was Dowler's business partner, Juan Casillas. After Dowler was laid off from his job at an oil company, he and Casillas opened a photo store together. In 1986, Kyle Chandler found Casillas at his home, dead on the kitchen floor. The autopsy revealed an unidentified substance in his tissues. Samples were saved according to hospital policy, but no cause of death was determined. Detective Brown now wondered if Kyle Chandler did more than just discover Juan Casillas' death. He began to think that maybe he caused it. Brown learned that Juan Casillas was married to Lisa Chandler before Kyle married her. First, Casillas died, and now Lisa was dead too. That gave Kyle Chandler a direct connection to 2 of the 3 mysterious deaths in his tight circle of friends. But Kyle Chandler wasn't the only suspect. In each of the 3 deaths, David Dowler made the phone call that led to the body being discovered. Detective Brown had 3 deaths and 2 likely suspects. He needed help sorting them out. He remembered an offer made to him by Carrie Middleton concerning David Dowler. She was convinced Dowler was the killer, living out some deranged fantasy. She wanted the chance to prove it.
During the interview with Carrie, I expressed some reservations to her about the story that she was telling me, and she voluntarily said that she would be more than happy to wear a microphone or a wire where I could firsthand listen to David Dowler telling her these stories.
David Dowler may have pretended to be a government agent, but Carrie Middleton was about to do some real undercover work.
Not everybody.
Okay. Just relax.
True to her word, she agreed to wear a wire so that police could hear her conversations with David Dowler.
Relax.
Okay, let's make sure it doesn't show up.
Detective Mickey Brown also had surveillance cameras set up in Carrie's apartment so police could watch them.
Hear me through this?
Yes, make sure.
We'll test it before you go in.
Put a couple buttons in so it doesn't.
Brown knew that time spent here would either help the investigation or take him down the entirely wrong road.
We're all set.
We had a total of 16 hours of recordings on him on about 3 occasions. He totally dominated the conversations. He talked constantly.
Most of the talk was idle banter. But in one of these conversations, he described how to murder someone by putting chloroform in their car ventilation. Then he outlined a likely method the killer would have used to kill Lisa Chandler with chloroform. Dowler offered detailed descriptions of how Lisa Craig and Juan Casillas were probably murdered using cyanide. And he told Carrie he was afraid she might be next. These were either the veiled confessions of a mad serial killer, the ramblings of a man desperate for attention, or both. His own words made Dowler the prime suspect. But the proof of those words had to be verified in the lab. Tissue samples from Lisa Craig and Juan Casillas were sent to Gary Wimbish to test for cyanide.
The test that we employed to assay for the cyanide actually is a testing protocol that is not ancient, but certainly has been around for a while, called a Conway diffusion cell.
It's a simple device that holds a blood sample in one compartment, a trapping solution in the center, and sulfuric acid on the other side. The container is then sealed and rotated so that the blood and acid mix. The acid releases the cyanide from the blood in its gaseous form, which is then trapped by the solution in the center compartment. The solution changes color to indicate how much cyanide is present.
We found rather large amounts of cyanide present in the blood specimens of Casillas and Craig. The concentrations were about 7 to 10 times the amount that are often found in lethal cases.
The results were indisputable. Both Craig and Casillas were killed with cyanide. To test Lisa Chandler, Wimbish used a gas chromatograph to detect traces of chloroform. A microscopic tissue sample was placed into the apparatus, which was calibrated to show the unique spectroscopic fingerprint of chlorine compounds.
This is the internal standard, and this is where
The test revealed that Lisa Chandler had enough chloroform in her system to kill 7 people.
All right, good.
Unmasked by his own incessant conversation, the real David Dowler was finally revealed.
And then once we verified through the post-mortem and the toxicology results that this was in fact how the victims had died, we knew then that we had our predator. We knew who we had then.
David Dowler wasn't a concerned friend or a government agent, but a very sick and dangerous serial killer. Armed with the toxicology reports and information gathered from surveillance, Detective Brown secured a warrant for Dowler's residence. But he wasn't through yet. He wanted to be sure he had enough to win this case. He hoped for a confession, if not to police, then to Carrie Middleton.
We decided to tape one more conversation to try to obtain as much evidence as possible.
By going through with another meeting, Brown was using his key witness as live bait for a known killer. Carrie was putting her life on the line. By now, Dowler might have suspected she was talking to police. Even with officers just outside, she'd be on her own if Dowler moved in quickly with a knife or gun. As an extra precaution, Detective Brown wired Carrie's entire home and had additional police standing by just in case. That evening, when Dowler came to Carrie's home, the two spoke amiably at first, concentrating on small talk. Then, Dowler began talking about how the police were bungling the investigation into Lisa Chandler's death. He mentioned that he kept a pistol in his car, and once again told Carrie that she was in danger. Then, he suddenly announced he had to leave for a moment, but that he'd be right back. That was enough for Detective Brown.
He's heading south.
Not wanting to
First
risk
Street.
Carrie's life any further, he had his officers move in and arrest Dowler in his car.
Down. Put your hands up. On your knees. On your knees.
From the evidence retrieved at the scene, Detective Brown may have acted just in time.
We arrested Dowler shortly after he left the witness's residence, and we found in his possession a pistol, a silencer, ammunition. We also found some lockpick sets and ski mask that he had.
These suspicious articles couldn't begin to suggest the vast and deadly arsenal Dowler had at his disposal. At his house, detectives uncovered explosives, blasting caps, crude eavesdropping equipment, more homemade gun silencers, and chemicals used to make explosives and poison. The police needed a truck to haul it all away. Dowler's lab was the incubator for 3 murders. Mixing chemicals into a lethal brew, he was able to concoct his deadly schemes. He denied killing Lisa Chandler and told investigators he was only trying to help her.
I was just be honest about what's really bothering me.
First, he said he had her write down questions about their relationship. Then he said he would help her find a hypnotic state by pouring chloroform into a washcloth that was covering her face. According to Dowler, she would then be able to answer her own questions with her subconscious. He said that she was getting tired, so he left.
Yeah.
Dowler claimed she must have taken more chloroform herself to commit suicide. Investigators didn't believe it. No bottle of chloroform was found at the scene. The forensics report also proved Dowler's story couldn't be true.
That couldn't have happened because when Dr. Wimbish did the toxicology, she had 7 times the toxic amount in her system, and she would have been sound asleep long before she could have self-administered that much chloroform to her.
Dowler had administered the fatal dose. He may have lived a fantasy life as a secret agent, but he played the real-life role of murderer. In January 1988, David Dowler was sentenced to life in prison for the death of Lisa Chandler. Because he received the highest possible penalty, he was not tried for the other 2 murders he is suspected of. David Dowler killed for the sake of killing. In Little Rock, Arkansas, investigators found that poison was just one part of a killer's elaborate master plan. Georgia Weaver had recently come to live with her sister, Jeannie Allen. When Jeannie had told her younger sister that her cozy home had become too much for her to manage by herself, Georgia was happy to move in and help out. On December 19, 1992, Jeannie was struck with a sudden, intense illness. Georgia, who also felt ill, rushed her sister to the hospital. For 2 weeks, doctors puzzled over the root of her symptoms, thinking it might be food poisoning. When her condition worsened, they ordered tests for heavy metal poisoning. The results showed Jeannie had nearly 20 times the normal amount of arsenic in her system. Intentionally or by accident, Jeannie Allen was being poisoned. Jeannie's son, Jerry Allen, reacted to the news by going to the police. He was certain his mother's poisoning was no accident. He told them that the situation wasn't always so rosy between his mother and his aunt, Georgia Weaver. Detective Steve Moore listened to Jerry Allen's story.
He told us that they had been involved in a dispute in years past over an inheritance from their mother who had died, and apparently Miss Weaver had spent some of the money without Miss Allen's knowledge.
The sisters hadn't spoken to each other for 4 years. Jeannie had only recently decided to make amends and invite Georgia back into her life. Jeannie was lonely. Her husband, James Allen, was incapacitated with a stroke, and her kids were grown. Georgia began spending the night at Jeannie's house and cooking all of the meals. But Jerry believed that Georgia was scheming to take financial advantage of his mother once again.
No.
3 months before Jeannie fell ill, Jerry confronted Georgia at his mother's house, triggering a tremendous argument. Georgia called the police to have Jerry removed from the premises. Bad blood clearly flowed within the family, but there was little to link it with Jeannie's current condition.
When Jerry Allen first came to us, we were concerned about, were we getting in the middle of a family squabble? Was there really a crime here? Was there really something we needed to be involved in?
But 2 days after Jerry filed his report, Jeannie Allen died from arsenic poisoning. Now the police had to get involved. Though it was still uncertain if Jeannie's poisoning was intentional, the death needed to be investigated. Police began by interviewing Jeannie's friends and family members.
Thank you.
Certainly. Something to eat?
No, thank you.
One of the first was Georgia Weaver.
All right, what can I help you with?
Cordial and friendly, her anger rose when she talked about her nephew, Jerry Allen.
Oh, I don't
Georgia told police that Jerry resented her because Jeannie trusted her more. She claimed that if anyone poisoned Jeannie, it would be Jerry, who was jockeying to gain control of Jeannie Allen's money. Investigators now had 2 suspects, and yet they weren't even certain a crime had been committed. Before they could determine that, they had to determine how long Jeannie Allen had been exposed to the arsenic and how she had consumed it. To find out if Jeannie Allen had been intentionally poisoned, investigators examined her hair. The arsenic leaves a record along the growing strands. The hair samples are cut into segments, then wrapped securely in a paper form that establishes the chain of evidence. Because plastic bags could contaminate biological samples, labs use paper wrapping. Each segment is individually tested for arsenic. The duration of a person's exposure can be determined by seeing how much of the hair contains the poison. According to criminalist Gary Lawrence, it is not uncommon to find arsenic in any hair sample.
Most people have a normal background level of arsenic within the body, and if they receive from some form an amount of arsenic that's abnormal to the body, I think the system has a way of working some of that out.
If the arsenic were in the environment, investigators would expect to find minute traces along the length of the hair. If the poison were administered intentionally, it would usually appear as one big dose on the portion of hair closest to the scalp.
I don't believe it's very easy to hide arsenic poisoning. It can be done, but again, even when you get up to the long-term dosages, even at low levels, the buildup of the arsenic within the body is eventually going to show up.
The report showed normal trace levels of arsenic along most of the length of the hair. But on the segment closest to the scalp, the hair contained 13 times the normal amount of the poison. The results suggested that Jeannie Allen's death was no accident.
Now let's get everything out of this closet.
To find the source of the arsenic, police conducted a search of her house and confiscated all of the food and medicine they could find. About 100 items in all. At the Arkansas State Crime Lab, each sample was bombarded with X-rays in a technique called X-ray fluorescence. Electrons in the samples become excited, giving off specific levels of energy. The lab looked for energy levels characteristic of arsenic. The lab tests for the samples taken from Jeannie Allen's home would take several months to complete.
What's the problem?
In the meantime, police conducted interviews with her
All of a
neighbors.
sudden, Georgia won't let me see her. I went
It
to a
wasn't
court.
long before they narrowed their list of
It's just
suspects
very
from
strange.
2
I understand
to
that there's
1.
money missing, that she's supposed to have.
Many neighbors said that mysterious changes occurred once Georgia Weaver moved in. Jeannie Allen came outside less and less. Georgia collected the mail and ran errands. Jeannie soon stopped calling her friends. And when they tried to get in touch with her, Georgia was always there, blocking the way.
If somebody went over there or called over there, Georgia answered the phone, Georgia came to the door, and they never saw Jeannie again. It was like she didn't exist, basically. Georgia checked the mail. Georgia basically took over the household, which made me suspicious that a grown lady that was not in any medical condition at that time, no senility or anything, would just let somebody take over their home like that.
As suspicions began focusing on Georgia Weaver, investigators uncovered more to incriminate her. On December 22nd, just days after Jeannie Allen was admitted to the hospital, Georgia went to the bank and, using a power of attorney, closed Jeannie Allen's account. She took $1,300 and the contents of her safe deposit box. Georgia was arrested at her job in a local motel. In her possession was about $1,000, Jeannie Allen's car, a credit card, and her power of attorney. Upon closer inspection, investigators noticed an odd detail about the power of attorney.
Yeah, see if you know these guys in there.
On this document, legally handing Jeannie's rights to Georgia Weaver, both Jeannie Allen's printed name and signature were misspelled. In order to get a true sample of Georgia's signature, police had her sign her name and Jeannie's several times in front of witnesses.
Oh no, we're not finished yet.
The signatures were sent to the Arkansas State Crime Lab for analysis. Jeannie Allen's known signature was compared with Georgia's version of the signature. The differences went beyond the spelling errors, according to Dawn Reed, chief of questioned documents.
There were pressure habits that were extremely different. Extreme differences were noted between the spacing habits of the writer on the question document and the known handwriting of Jeannie Allen. The uppercase J was a two-stroke J that Jeannie Allen usually wrote, and on the question document it was very flourished.
But when Reed compared the signatures written by Georgia Weaver to the one on the power of attorney, she knew she caught the forger hands down.
I positively identified Georgia Weaver as writing Jeannie Allen's signature on the power of attorney, which is totally conclusive. There was no qualified opinion. She wrote that. The probability that any other individual could have is nil.
Georgia was arrested for theft and forgery. She may have been a killer, too, if investigators could only prove it. Georgia Weaver posted bond for her arrests on theft and forgery. But her troubles weren't over. A few weeks later, she was charged with stealing employee checks from the motel where she worked and forging the signatures on them. She was arrested again. Though she was proving to be a thief and a forger, investigators had nothing to tie her to the murder of her sister, Jeannie Allen. Then, a co-worker reported finding a bottle of rat poison hidden where Georgia always kept her purse. It wasn't a brand the motel used. It was sent to the police and passed on to the Arkansas State Crime Lab for analysis. The active ingredient was arsenic. This evidence, tangible but circumstantial, was the first to link Georgia to the poison. Now, investigators needed to link the source of the poison to her sister. In August 1993, the extensive tests on items from Jeannie Allen's home were complete. Arsenic was discovered in 2 containers of punch and a bottle of cold medicine. The link was established. Detective Moore only hoped it was strong enough.
At that point, I felt we had what we needed to bring her to justice. We knew that it would be a battle as far as getting her convicted, but we didn't feel that we had any other choice but to try to get her put in prison where we felt she belonged.
From the evidence, investigators surmised that after ingratiating herself with her sister, Georgia began spiking her medicine and beverages with the rat poison she kept hidden at her workplace, finally killing her with one big dose. On May 4th, 1994, Georgia Weaver was convicted of the capital murder of her sister, Jeannie Allen.
I believe what motivated Georgia was greed, power, and also probably a motivational fact was that she wanted what Jeannie had as far as a home, a family, the financial stability that she had, whereas Georgia was alone, out of money. And I believe that maybe that she saw that's the only way she could get what that had was to take this route.
But the route she took proved to be a dead end. Georgia Weaver was sentenced to life in prison with no parole and is currently serving at the Arkansas Department of Corrections. The act of poisoning begins with a simple premise. The poisoner believes he can hide his guilt behind a mask of concern. But time and again, forensics has proven this premise false.